somewhat relieved also. Yes, on the one hand I had been an asset and had developed trading skills, and put them to good use for the benefit of the family. But on the other hand there was the drinking, the brawling, and, of course, the rift with the Cobleys. Shortly after the 2 dead carcasses had been deposited in our front yard, there'd been another incident where we'd woken to find the flock had been let out in the night. Father thought fences had been deliberately damaged. I didn't tell Father about what had happened at the quayside, but it was obvious Tom Cobley still harboured a grudge that wasn't likely to go away any time soon. That I had brought down on Father's head, and without me in the picture, then perhaps the vendetta would end. And so as I laid my head down that night, my only decision was how to break the news to my father, and how my father might break the news to my mother. And then I heard something from the window. A tapping. I looked out with no little trepidation. What did I expect to see? I wasn't sure, but the memories of the Cobleys were still fresh in my mind. Instead, what I saw, sitting astride her horse in the pale moonlight of the yard, as though God himself was shining his lantern upon her beauty, was Caroline Scott. She was dressed as if for riding school. Her clothes were dark. She wore a tall hat and a white shirt and black jacket. With one hand she held the reins, and the other was raised, about to throw a second fistful of gravel at my window. I myself had been known to use the very same trick to attract the attention of a lady friend, and I remembered well the terror of waking up the whole household. So when I threw stones at a casement window, I usually did it from behind the safety of a stone wall. Not Caroline. That was the difference in our social standing. She had no fears of being run off the property with a boot in her behind and a flea in her ear. She was Caroline Scott of Hawkins Lane in Bristol. She herself was being courted by the son of an East India Company executive. Clandestine assignation or not, and there was no doubt this was clandestine, hiding behind stone walls was not for her. "Well," she whispered. I saw her eyes dance in the moonlight. "Are you going to leave me sitting out here all night?" No. In moments I was in the yard by her side, taking the reins of the horse and walking her away from the property as we spoke. "Your actions the other day," she said. "You put yourself in great danger in order to protect that young thief." Yes, I know what you're thinking, and yes, I did feel a little guilt at that. But not too much guilt. "And there is nothing I hate so much as a bully, Miss Scott," I said, which did at least have the benefit of being true. So I thought. This is twice now I've been most impressed by the gallantry of your actions. Then it is on 2 occasions that I have been pleased you were there to witness it. You interest me, Mr. Kenway, and your own interest in me has not gone unremarked. I stayed silent, and we walked for a while, and even though no words were spoken, there was meaning in our silence, as though we acknowledged our feelings for each other. I felt the closeness of her riding boot. Above the heat and scent of the horse, I thought I could smell the powder she wore. Never before had I been so aware of a person, of the nearness of a person. "I expect you have been told that I am betrothed to another," she said. We stopped along the lane. There were stone walls on either side of us, the green pastures beyond interrupted by clusters of white sheep. The air was warm and dry around us, not even a breeze to disturb the trees that rose to make the skyline. From somewhere came the cry of an animal, lovelorn or hurt, but certainly feral, and a sudden disturbance in the bushes startled us. We felt like interlopers, uninvited guests to nature's household. "Why, I don't think—" "Mr. Kenway, You can call me Edward, Miss Scott. Well, you can continue calling me Miss Scott. Really? Oh, go on then, you can call me Caroline. Thank you, Miss Scott. She gave me a sideways look, as though to check whether or not I was mocking her. Well, Edward, she continued, I know full well you've been making inquiries about me. And though I do not pretend to know exactly what you've been told, I think I know the gist. That Caroline Scott is betrothed to Matthew Haig, that Matthew Haig bombards her with love poems, that the union has the blessing of his father and, of course, her father. Am I right? I admitted I had heard as much. Perhaps in the short dealings we have had together you might understand how I would feel about this particular arrangement. I wouldn't like to say. Then I shall spell it out for you. The thought of marriage to Matthew Haig turns my stomach. Do you think I want to live my life in the household of the Haigs, expected to treat my husband like a king, turn a blind eye to his affairs, run the household, shout at the staff, choose flowers and pick out doilies, go visiting, take tea, trade gossip with other wives? Do you think I want to hide myself so deeply beneath the petty concerns of manners and etiquette that I can no longer find myself? At the moment I live between two worlds, Edward, able to see them both. The world I see on my visits to the harbour is the world that is most real to me, Edward, the one that is most alive. And as for Matthew Haig himself, I despise him almost as much as his poetry. Do not think me a helpless damsel in distress, Edward, because I am not that. But I'm not here for your help. I have come to help myself. You've come to help yourself to me, if you wish. Your next move is yours to make. But if you make it, do so knowing this. Any relationship between you and me would not have the blessing of my father, but it would have mine. Excuse me, but it's not so much your father who concerns me, as his choice for you. And the thought of making an enemy of the Haigs, does that put you off? I knew at that moment nothing would put me off. No, Caroline, it doesn't. I hoped as much. We parted with arrangements made to meet again. And after that our relationship began in earnest. We were able to keep it a secret. For some months, in fact, our meetings were held entirely in private. Snatched moments spent wandering the lanes between Bristol and Hatherton, riding in the pastures. Until one day she announced that Matthew Haig planned to ask for her hand in marriage the following morning, and my heart stopped. I was determined not to lose her. Because of my love for her, because I could think of nothing but her, because when we were together I savoured every moment. Every word, every gesture that Caroline made was like nectar to me. Everything about her, every curve and contour, her scent, her laugh, her refined manners, her intelligence. And all of this ran through my mind as I dropped to one knee and took her hand. Because what she was telling me, perhaps it wasn't an invitation, but a farewell. And if it was, well, at least my humiliation would not be known far and wide, confined to the birds in the trees and the cows that stood in the fields watching us, with sleepy eyes and chewing ruminatively. Caroline, will you marry me? I said. I held my breath. During our courtship, every meeting we'd had, every stolen kiss we'd shared, I'd been haunted by a feeling of not believing my luck. It was as though a great joke was being played on me. I half expected Tom Cobley to come leaping out of the shadows, snorting with laughter. And if not that, if not some vengeful practical joke at my expense, then perhaps I was merely a diversion for Caroline, a final fling before she applied herself to her familial duty. "Ah, Edward," she smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." 9. I couldn't accept it, though, and I found myself travelling into town the next day, my journey taking me to Hawkins Lane. All I knew was that Matthew Haigh planned to pay her a visit in the morning, and as I sidled up the highway and past the row of houses among which was hers, I wondered if he was in there now, perhaps making his proposal. One thing I knew of Caroline. She was a brave woman, the bravest I'd ever known, but even so, she was passing up the opportunity to live the rest of her days in pampered luxury. And worse, she was going to scandalize her mother and father. I knew only too well the pressures of trying to please a parent, how tempting it was to go down that route. An unfulfilled soul, or a soul troubled with guilt? Which was the hardest cross to bear? With me standing before her, and she loved me, I'm sure of that, perhaps the decision was easier to make. But what about at night, when misgivings made their rounds and doubt came visiting? Perhaps she might simply have changed her mind, and she was at this very moment blushing in her acceptance of Matthew Haigh's proposal, and mentally writing a letter to me. And if that happened, well, it was always Dylan Wallace, I suppose. But then from the corner of my eye I saw the front door open, and Wilson appear, quickly followed by the draftsman, and behind them Matthew Haigh, who offered his arm for Caroline, Rose taking up the rear as they began their perambulations. Staying some distance behind, I followed them all the way to the harbour, puzzling over his intentions. Not the harbour, surely. The dirty, smelly, crowded harbour, with its stench of manure and burning pitch, and just-caught fish, and men who had returned from months away at sea without so much as a bath during that time. They were making their way towards what looked like a schooner moored at the dock, around which were gathered some men. It was difficult to tell, though, because hanging from the back of the ship was some kind of canvas, obscuring the name of the vessel. However, as the group drew closer to it, I thought I knew what it was. I thought I knew his plan. Sure enough, they stopped before it, and still out of sight, I watched as Caroline's eyes flicked nervously from Matthew Haigh to the schooner, guessing that she too had worked out the purpose of their visit. Next thing I knew, Haigh was down on one knee, and the staff of the schooner, Wilson and the draftsman, were all standing with their hands behind their backs, ready for the round of applause as Matthew Haigh popped his question. "My darling, would you do me the honour of becoming my wife?" Caroline swallowed and stammered. "Matthew, must we do this here?" He shot her a patronizing look, then with an expansive gesture of his hand, ordered the canvas come off the rear of the schooner. There, etched in a gold leaf, was the vessel's name. Caroline. Where better place, my dear? And if it hadn't been for the situation, I might even have slightly enjoyed the sight of Caroline at a loss. Usually she was nothing if not sure of herself. The doubt and near panic I saw in her eyes was, I suspect, as new to her as it was to me. "Matthew, I must say, you're embarrassing me." "My dear, dear Caroline, my precious flower," he said, and made a small gesture to his draftsman, who immediately began rooting around for his quill in order to record his master's poetic words. "But how else would I have unveiled my marital gift to you? Now I must press you for an answer. Please, with all these people watching." And yes, I realized, looking around, the entire harbour seemed to have halted, everybody hanging on Caroline's next words, which were, "No, Matthew." Haigh stood up so sharply that his draftsman was forced to scurry backwards and almost lost his footing. Haig's face darkened and his lips pursed as he fought to retain composure and force a smile. "One of your little jokes, perhaps?" "I fear not, Matthew. I am betrothed to another." Haig drew himself up to his full height, as though to intimidate Caroline. Standing back in the crowd, I felt my blood rising and began to make my way forward. "To another?" he croaked. "And just who is this other man?" "Me, sir," I announced, having reached the front of the crowd and presented myself to him. He looked at me with narrowed eyes. "You?" he spat. From behind him, Wilson was already moving forward, and in his eyes I could see his fury that I'd failed to heed his warning, and how that became his failure. With an outstretched arm, Haig stopped him. "No, Wilson," he said, adding pointedly, "not here. Not now. I'm sure my lady may want to reconsider." A ripple of surprise and, I guess, not a little humour had travelled through the crowd, and it rose again as Caroline said, "No, Matthew, Edward and I are to be married." He rounded on her. "And does your father know about this?" "Not yet," she said, then added, "I've a feeling he soon will, though." For a moment Haig simply stood and trembled with rage, and for the first, but not, as it would turn out, the last time, I actually felt sympathy for him. In the next instant he was barking at bystanders to get back to their work, then shouting at the schooner crew to replace the canvas, then calling to Wilson and his draftsman to leave the harbour, turning his back pointedly on Caroline, and offering me a look of hate as he exited. At his rear was Wilson, and our eyes locked. Slowly he drew a finger across his throat. I shouldn't have done it, really. Wilson was not a man to provoke, but I couldn't help myself, returning his death threat with a cheeky wink. 10. And that was how Bristol came to know that Edward Kenway, a sheep farmer worth a mere £75 a year, was to marry Caroline Scott. And what a scandal it was. Caroline Scott marrying beneath her would have been cause for gossip enough. That she had spurned Matthew Haig in the process constituted quite a stir, and I wonder if that scandal might ultimately have worked in our favour, because while I steeled myself for retribution, and for a while I looked for Wilson round every corner, and my first glance from the window to the yard each morning was filled with trepidation, none came. I saw nothing of Wilson, heard nothing of Matthew Haig. In the end, the threat to our marriage came not from outside, not from the Cobleys, Emmett Scott, Matthew Haig, or Wilson. It came from the inside. It came from me. I've had plenty of time to think about the reasons why, of course, and the problem was that I kept returning to my meeting with Dylan Wallace and his promises of riches in the West Indies. I wanted to go and return to Caroline a rich man. I had begun to see it as my only chance of making a success of myself, my only chance of being worthy of her. For of course, yes, there was the immediate glory, or perhaps you might say stature, of having made Caroline Scott my wife, taking her from beneath the nose of Matthew Haig, but that was soon followed by a kind of, well, I can only describe it as stagnation. Emmett Scott had delivered his cutting blow at the wedding. We should have been grateful, I suppose, that he and Caroline's mother had deigned to attend, although for my own part I was not at all grateful. I would have preferred it if the pair of them had stayed away. I hated to see my father, cap in hand, bowing and scraping to Emmett Scott, hardly a nobleman after all, just a merchant, separated from us not by any aristocratic leanings, but by money alone. For Caroline, though, I was glad they came. It wasn't as if they approved of the marriage, far from it, but at the very least they weren't prepared to lose their daughter over it. I overheard her mother say, "We just want you to be happy, Caroline." I knew that she was speaking for herself alone. In the eyes of Emmett Scott I saw no such desire. I saw the look of a man who had been denied his chance to clamber higher up the social ladder, a man whose dreams of great influence had been dashed. He came to the wedding under sufferance, or perhaps for the pleasure of delivering his pronouncement in the churchyard after the vows had been made. Emmett Scott had black hair brushed forward, dark, sunken cheeks, and a mouth pinched permanently into a shape like a cat's anus. His face, in fact, wore the permanent expression of a man biting deep into the flesh of a lemon. Except for this one occasion, when his lips pressed into a thin smile, and he said, "There will be no dowry." His wife, Caroline's mother, closed her eyes tightly as though it was a moment she dreaded, had hoped might not happen. Words had been exchanged, I could guess, and the last of them had belonged to Emmett Scott. So we moved into an outhouse on my father's farm. We had appointed it as best we could, but it was still at the end of the day an outhouse, packed mud and sticks for the walls, our roof thatch badly in need of repair. Our union had begun in the summer, of course, when our home was a cool sanctuary away from the blazing sun, but in winter, in the wet and wind, it was no kind of sanctuary at all. Caroline had been used to a brick-built townhouse with the life of Bristol all around, with servants to boot, her washing, her cooking, every whim attended to. Here she was not rich, she was poor, and her husband was poor, with no prospects. I began visiting the inns once more, but I was not the same man as before. Not as I'd been in the days when I was a single man, the cheerful, boisterous drunk, the jester. Now I had the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I sat with my back to the room, hunched, brooding over my ale, feeling as though they were all talking about me, like they were all saying, "There's Edward Kenway who can't provide for his wife." I had suggested it to Caroline, of course, me becoming a privateer. And while she hadn't said no, she was still my wife, after all. She hadn't said yes, and in her eyes were doubt and worry. "I don't want to leave you alone, but I can leave here poor and come back rich," I told her. Now, if I was to go, I went without her blessing. I went without her blessing, and I left her alone in a farmyard shack, and her father would say I had deserted her, and her mother would despise me for making Caroline unhappy. I couldn't win. "Is it dangerous?" she asked one night when I spoke about privateering. "It wouldn't be so highly paid if it wasn't," I told her, and of course she reluctantly agreed that I could go. What choice did she have? But I didn't want to leave her behind with a broken heart. One morning I awoke from a drunken stupor, blinking in the morning light, only to find Caroline already dressed for the day ahead. "I don't want you to go," she said, and turned and left the room. Another night I sat in a livid bruise. I'd like to say I was not my usual self as I sat with my back to the rest of the tavern, hunched over my tankard, taking great big gulps in between dark thoughts and watching the level fall. Always watching the level of my ale fall. But the sad fact of the matter was that I was my usual self. That younger man, always ready with a quip and a smile, had disappeared. In his place, still a young man, but one who now had the cares of the world on his shoulders. On the farm, Caroline helped Mother, who at first had been horrified by the idea, saying Caroline was too much of a lady to work on the farm. Caroline had just laughed and insisted. When I had watched her stride across the same yard where I had first seen her sitting astride her horse, now wearing a crisp white bonnet, work boots, a smock and apron, I'd had a proud feeling. Now, when I saw her in work clothes, it reminded me of my own failings as a man. What made it worse, somehow, was that Caroline didn't seem to mind. It was as though she was the only person in the area who did not see her current position as a descent down the social ladder. Everybody else did, and none felt it more keenly than me. "Can I get you another ale?" I recognised the voice that came from behind me and turned to see him there. Emmett Scott, Caroline's father. I'd last seen him at the wedding when he refused his daughter her dowry. Now he was offering his hated son-in-law a drink. That's the thing about the drink, though. When you're into the drink like I was, when you watch the level of your ale fall and wonder where your next one is coming from, you'll take a fresh mug from anyone. Even Emmett Scott, your sworn enemy, a man who hated you almost as much as you hated him. So I accepted his offer of an ale, and he bought his own and pulled up a stool which scraped on the flagstones as he sat down. You remember Emmett Scott's expression, that of a man sucking a lemon. Now, talking to me, the hated Edward Kenway, you'd have to say he looked even more pained. The tavern was somewhere I felt completely at home, an environment in which I could lose myself. But it didn't suit him at all. Every now and then he would glance over one shoulder, then the other, like he was frightened of being suddenly attacked from behind. "I don't think we've ever had a chance to talk," he said, and I made a short, scoffing laugh in reply. "Your appearance at the wedding put paid to that, did it not?" Of course, the booze had loosened my tongue, made me brave. That and the fact that in the battle to win his daughter, I had won. Her heart, after all, belonged to me, and there was no greater evidence of her devotion to me than the fact that she had given up so much to be with me. Even he must have seen that. "We're both men of the world, Edward," he said simply, and you could see he was trying to make himself seem in charge. But I saw through him. I saw what he really was. A frightened, nasty man, browbeaten in business, who kicked downwards, who probably beat his servants and his wife, who assumed the likes of me ought to be bowing and scraping to him, as my mother and father had, and I had a twinge of rage to remember it, at the wedding. "How about we do a deal like businessmen?" I took a long slug of my ale and held his eyes. "What did you have in mind, father-in-law of mine?" His face hardened. "You walk out on her. You throw her out, whatever you want. You set her free. Send her back to me. And if I do, I'll make you a rich man." I drained the rest of my ale. He nodded towards it with questioning eyes, and I said yes, waited while he fetched another one, and drank it down almost in one go. The room was beginning to spin. "Well, you know what you can do with your offer, don't you?" "Edward," he said, leaning forward, "you and I both know you can't provide for my daughter. You and I both know you sit here in despair because you can't provide for my daughter. You love her, I know that, because I was once, like you, a man of no qualities." I looked at him with my teeth clenched. No qualities? "Oh, it's true," he spat, sitting back. "You're a sheep farmer, boy." "What happened to Edward? I thought you were talking to me like an equal." "An equal? There will never be a day when you will be equal to me, and you know it." "You're wrong. I have plans." "I've heard about your plans. Privateering, becoming a man of substance on the high seas. You don't have it in you, Edward Kenway." "I do." "You don't have the moral fibre. I am offering you a way out of the hole you have dug for yourself, boy. I suggest you think about it very hard." I sank the rest of my ale. "How about I think about it over another drink?" "As you wish." A fresh tankard materialized on the table in front of me, and I set to making it a thing of history, my mind reeling at the same time. He was right. This was the most devastating thing about the whole conversation. Emmett Scott was right. I loved Caroline, yet could not provide for her. And if I truly was a dutiful husband, then I would accept his offer. She doesn't want me to go away, I said. And you want to? I want for her to support my plans. She never will. I can but hope. If she loves you, as she says, she never will. Even in my drunken state, I could not fault his logic. I knew he was right. He knew he was right. You have made enemies, Edward Kenway. Many enemies, some of them powerful. Why do you think those enemies haven't taken their revenge on you? They're frightened? A drunken arrogance in my voice. He scoffed. Of course they're not frightened. They leave you alone because of Caroline. Then if I was to accept your offer, there would be nothing to stop my enemies from attacking me. Nothing but my protection. I wasn't sure about that. I sank another ale. He sank deeper into despondency. He was still there at the end of the night, his very presence reminding me how far my choices had shrunk. When I tried to stand to leave, my legs almost gave way, and I had to grab the side of the table just to remain on my feet. Caroline's father, a disgusted look on his face, came to help me, and before I knew it he was taking me home, though not because he wanted to see me safe, but because he wanted to make sure Caroline saw me in my drunken state, which indeed she did as I rolled in, laughing. Emmett Scott puffed up and told her, "This tosspot is a ruined man, Caroline, unfit for life on land, much less at sea. If he goes to the West Indies, it's you who will suffer." "Father, father!" She was sobbing, so upset. And then as I lay on the bed I saw his boots move off and he was gone. "That old muckworm," I managed. "He's wrong about me." "I hope it's so," she replied. I let my drunken imagination carry me away. "You believe me, don't you? Can you not see me standing out there on the deck of a ship sliding into port? And there I am, a man of quality, with 1,000 doubloons spilling from my pockets like drops of rain. I can see it." When I looked at her, she was shaking her head. She couldn't see it. And when I sobered up the next day, neither could I. It was only a matter of time, I suppose. My lack of prospects became like another person in the marriage. I reviewed my options. Emmett Scott offering me money in return for having his daughter back. My dreams of sailing away. Both of them involved breaking Caroline's heart. 11. The next day I went back to see Emmett Scott, returning to Hawkins Lane, where I knocked on the door to request an audience. Who should answer but Rose? "Mr. Kenway," she said, surprised and going slightly red. There was a moment of awkwardness, and then I was being asked to wait, and then, shortly after that, was led to Emmett Scott's study, a room dominated by a desk in its centre, wood panelling giving it a dark, serious atmosphere. He stood in front of his desk, and in the gloom, with his dark hair, his cadaverous look, and dark, hollowed-out cheeks, he looked like a crow. "You have thought my offer over, then?" he said. "I have," I replied, "and felt it best to tell you my decision as soon as possible." He folded his arms and his face cracked into a triumphant smirk. "You come to make your demands, then? How much is my daughter worth?" "How much were you willing to pay?" "Were?" It was my turn to smile, though I was careful not to overdo it. He was dangerous, Emmett Scott. I was playing a dangerous game with a dangerous man. "That's right. I've decided to go to the West Indies." I knew where I could reach Dillon Wallace. I'd given Caroline the news. I see. He seemed to think, tapping his fingers together. But you don't intend to stay away permanently? No. This was not the terms of my offer. Not quite the terms of your offer, no, I said. In effect, a counter-offer. A measure I hope will find your favour. I'm a Kenway, Mr. Scott. I have my pride. That I hope you will understand. Understand, too, that I love your daughter, however much that fact may ail you, and I wish nothing but the best for her. I aim to return from my travels a rich man, and with my fortune give Caroline the life she deserves, a life I'm sure you would wish for her. He was nodding, though the purse of his lips betrayed his utter contempt for the notion. And? I give you my word I will not return to these shores until I am a rich man. I see. And I give you my word I will not tell Caroline that you attempted to buy her back. He darkened. I see. I ask only to be given the opportunity to make my fortune, to provide for Caroline in the manner to which she has become accustomed. You will still be her husband. It is not what I wanted. You think me a good-for-nothing, not fit to be her husband. I hope to prove you wrong. While I am away, you will no doubt see more of Caroline. Perhaps if your hatred of me runs so deeply, you might use the opportunity to poison her against me. The point is, you would have ample opportunity. Moreover, I might die while at sea, in which case she is returned to you forever, a young widow still at an eligible age. That is my deal. In return, I ask only that you allow me to try to make something of myself, unhindered. He nodded, considering the idea, perhaps savouring the thought of me dying while at sea. 12. Dillon Wallace assigned me to the crew of the Emperor, which was docked in Bristol Harbour and leaving in 2 days. I returned home and told my mother, father, and Caroline. There were tears, of course, and recriminations, and pleas to stay. But I was firm in my resolve, and after I'd broken my news, Caroline, distraught, left. She needed time to think, she said, and we stood in the yard and watched her gallop away, to her family, where at least she would give the news to Emmett Scott, who would know I was fulfilling my part of the deal. I could only hope, or should I say, I hoped at the time, that he would fulfill his part of the deal too. Sitting here talking to you now all these years later, well, it has to be said that I don't know whether he did. But I will. Shortly I will. And there will be a day of reckoning. But not then. Then I was young, stupid, arrogant, and boastful. I was so boastful that once Caroline was away, I took to the taverns again, and perhaps found that some of my old liveliness had returned, as I told all who would listen that I was to sail away, and that Mr. and Mrs. Edward Kenway would soon be a rich couple, thanks to my endeavours on the high seas. I took great delight in their sneering looks, their rejoinders that I was too big for my boots, or did not have enough character for the task, that I would soon return with my tail between my legs, that I was letting down my father. Not once did I let my grin slip, my knowing grin, my grin that said, "You'll see." But even with the booze inside me and my departure a day or so away, or maybe even because of those things, I still took their words to heart. I asked myself, did I really have enough of a man inside me to survive the life of the privateer? Was I going to return with my tail between my legs? And yes, I knew that I might die. And also, they were right. I was letting my father down. I'd seen the disappointment in his eyes the moment I delivered the news, and it had remained there since. It was a sadness, perhaps, that his dream of running the farm together, fading as it must have been, had finally been dashed for good. I was not just leaving to embrace a new life, but wholeheartedly rejecting my old one. The life he had built for himself, my mother and me. I was rejecting it. I'd decided I was too good for it. Perhaps I never gave enough thought to the effect that all of this might have on Caroline's relationship with my mother and father, but looking back now, it is ludicrous of me to have expected her to simply remain at the farm. One night I returned home to find her dressed up. "Where are you going?" I slurred, having spent most of the evening in a tavern. She was unable to meet my gaze. By her feet was a bedsheet tied into a bulging parcel, somehow at odds with her attire, which as I focused on her I realized was more smart than usual. "No, I—" Finally her eyes met mine. "My parents have asked me to go and live with them, and I'd like to." "What do you mean, live with them? You live here, with me?" She told me that I shouldn't have given up work with father. I should have been happy with what I had. I should have been happy with her. Through a fog of ale I tried to tell her that I was happy with her, that everything I was doing for her. She had been talking to her parents while she was away, of course, and while I had expected her father to begin poisoning her against me, that muckworm, I hadn't expected him to start quite so soon. "Decent wage?" I raged. "That job was near as damn it to robbery. You want to be married to a peasant the whole of your life?" I'd spoken too loudly. A look passed between us, and I cringed to think of my father hearing. And then she was leaving, and I was calling after her, still trying to persuade her to stay. To no avail. And the next morning, when I'd sobered up and recalled the events of the night before, mother and father were brooding, staring at me with recriminatory looks. Not only had they liked, I'd go as far as saying loved, Caroline, because mother had lost a daughter many years ago, so to her Caroline was the daughter she never had. But she was also a help around the farm, and did it for minimal wages. To help out, so she said. "Maybe before the baby arrives," my mother would say, and give my grinning father a nudge in the ribs, to which Caroline would blush to her roots and reply, "Maybe." Well, we were trying, and there'd be an end to that when I was away on my travels, of course. And apart from being well-liked and a help on the farm, another female to have around the place, she'd also been helping my mother with her numbers and letters. Now she was gone. Gone because I had not been content with my lot. Gone because I wanted adventure, because the drink was no longer doing anything to stave off boredom. Why couldn't I be happy with her, she'd asked. I was happy with her. Why couldn't I be happy with my life, she'd asked. But I wasn't happy with my life. I went to see her to try to persuade her to change her mind. As far as I was concerned, she was still my wife, I was still her husband, and what I was doing was for the good of the marriage, for the good of both of us, not just me. And I think I kidded myself that was true. And maybe to some small degree it was true. But I knew, and probably she knew too, that while of course I wanted to provide for her, I also wanted to see the world beyond Bristol. It did no good. She told me she was worried about me being hurt. I replied that I would be careful, that I would return with coin or send for her. I told her I needed her faith, but my appeals fell on deaf ears. It was the day I was due to leave, and I left them and I packed my bags, slung them over my horse, and went, with those very same recriminatory looks boring into my back, stabbing at me like arrows. And I rode into the dark as evening fell with a heavy heart, and there found the Emperor. But instead of the expected industry, the ship due to sail the following morning, I found it near deserted. The only people present were a group of 6 men who I took to be deckhands, who sat gambling with leather flasks of rum close at hand, casks for chairs, a crate for a dice table. I looked from them to the Emperor. A refitted merchant ship, she was riding high in the water. The decks were empty, none of the lamps were lit, and the railings shone in the moonlight. A sleeping giant she was. And despite feeling perplexed at the lack of activity, I was still in awe of her size and stature. On those decks I would serve. On hammocks in quarters below decks I would sleep. The masts I would climb. I was looking at my new home. One of the men eyed me carefully. "Now, what can I do for you?" he said. I swallowed, feeling very young and inexperienced, and suddenly, tragically wondering if everything they said about me, Caroline's father, the drinkers in the taverns, even Caroline herself, might be true. That actually, I might not be cut out for life at sea. "I'm here to join up," I said. "Sent here by Dylan Wallace." A snicker ran through the group of 4, and each of them looked at me with an even greater interest. "Dylan Wallace, the recruitment man, eh?" said the first. "He's sent 1 or 2 to us before. What is it you can do, boy?" "Mr. Wallace thought I would be material enough to serve," I said, hoping I sounded more confident and able than I felt. "How's your eyesight?" said one. "My eyesight is fine." "Do you have a head for heights?" I knew what they meant now, as they pointed up to the highest point of the Emperor's rigging, the crow's nest, home to the lookout. "Mr. Wallace had me more in mind as a deckhand, I think." Officer material was what he'd actually said, but I wasn't about to tell this lot. I was young and nervous, not stupid. "Well, can you sew, lad?" came the reply. They were mocking me, surely. "What does sewing have to do with privateering, then?" I asked, feeling a little impudent despite the circumstances. "The deckhand needs to be able to sew, boy," said one of the other men. Like all the others, he had a tarred pigtail and tattoos that crept from the sleeves and neck of his shirt. "Needs to be good with knots, too. Are you good with knots, boy?" "These are things I can learn," I replied. I stared at the ship with its furled sails, rigging hanging in tidy loops from the masts, and the hull studded with brass barrels peeking from its gun deck. I saw myself like the men who sat on the casks before me, their faces leathery and tanned from their time at sea, eyes that gleamed with menace and adventure, custodians of the ship. "You have to get used to a lot else as well besides," said one man. "Scraping barnacles off the hull, caulking the boat with tar." "You got your sea legs, son?" asked another. They were laughing at me now. "Can you keep your stomach when she's lashed with waves and hurricane winds?" "I reckon I can," I replied, adding with a surge of impetuous anger, "Either way, that's not why Mr. Wallace thought I might make a good crewmate." A look passed between them. The atmosphere had changed a little. "Oh, yes," said one of them, swinging his legs round. He wore dirty canvas trousers. "And why is it that the recruiting officer thought you might make a good crewmate, then?" "Having seen me in action, he thought I might be useful in a battle." He stood. "A fighter, eh?" "That's right." "Well, you have ample opportunity to prove your abilities in that area, boy. Starting tomorrow. Perhaps I'll put myself down for a bout, shall I?" "What do you mean, tomorrow?" I asked. He had sat down, returning his attention to the game. "Tomorrow when we sail." "I was told we sailed tonight." "Sail tomorrow, lad. Captain isn't even here yet. We sail first thing." I left them, knowing I might well have made my first enemies on ship. Still, I had some time. Time to put things right. I retrieved my horse and headed for home. 13. I galloped towards Atherton, towards home. Why was I going back? Perhaps to tell them I was sorry. Perhaps to explain what was going through my mind. After all, I was their son. Maybe father would recognize in me some vestige of himself, and maybe if he did, he would forgive me. Because as I travelled back along the highway, what I realized more than anything was that I wanted him to forgive me. Both of them. Is it any wonder that I was distracted, that my guard was down? I was near to home, where the trees formed a narrow avenue, when I sensed the movement in the hedgerow. I drew to a halt and listened. When you live in the countryside, you sense the changes, and something was different now. From above came a sharp whistle that could only have been a warning, and at the same time I saw more movement ahead of me, except this was in the yard of our farmhouse. My heart hammered as I spurred my horse and galloped towards the yard. At the same time I saw the unmistakable flare of a torch. Not a lamp, but a torch. The kind of torch you might use if you were intending to set something ablaze. At the same time I saw running figures, and in the glare of torchlight saw that they wore hoods. "Hey!" I shouted, as much to try to wake mother and father as to frighten off our attackers. "Hey!" I yelled again. A torch arced through the air, twirling end over end, leaving an orange trail in the night sky before landing in a shower of sparks on the thatch of our home. It was dry, tinder dry. We tried to keep it doused in the summer because the risk of fire was so great, but there was always something more important to do, and, at a guess, it hadn't been done for a week because it went up like whoomph. I saw more figures, 3, perhaps 4. And then just as I came into the yard and pulled up, a shape flew at me from the side, hands grabbed my tunic, and I was dragged from the back of my horse. The breath was driven from me as I thumped hard to the ground. Nearby were rocks for a stone wall. Weapons. Then above me loomed a figure that blocked out the moon, hooded like the others. Before I could react, he stooped and I caught a brief impression of the hood fabric, pulsing at his mouth as he breathed hard, and then his fist smashed into my face. I twisted and his second blow landed on my neck. Beside him appeared another figure, and I saw a glint of steel and knew I was powerless to do anything, and prepared to die. But the first man stopped the new arrival with a simple, barked, "No," and I was saved from the blade at least, but not from the beating, and a boot in my midriff doubled me up. That boot. I recognized that boot. Again it came, again and again, until at last it stopped and my attacker ran off. My hands went to my wounded belly, and I rolled onto my front and coughed, the blackness threatening to engulf me. Maybe I'd let it. The idea of sinking into oblivion seemed tempting. Let unconsciousness take the pain, deliver me into the future. The sound of running feet as my attackers escaped, some indistinct shouting, the cries of the disturbed ewes. But no. I was still alive, wasn't I? About to kiss steel, I'd been given a second chance, and that was too good a chance to pass up. I had my parents to save, and even then I knew that I was going to make these people pay. The owner of those boots would regret not killing me when he had the chance. Of that I was sure. I pulled myself up. Smoke drifted across the yard like a bank of incoming fog. One of the barns was already alight. The house, too. I needed to wake them, needed to wake my mother and father. The dirt around me was bathed in the orange glow of the fire. As I stood, I was aware of horses' hooves and swung about to see several riders retreating, riding away from the farmhouse, their job done, the place well alight now. I snatched up a rock and considered hurling it at one of the riders. But there were more important matters to worry about, and instead, with a grunt that was part effort and part pain, I launched it at the top window of the farmhouse. My aim was true, and I prayed it would be enough to rouse my parents. The smoke thick in the yard now, the roar of the flames like an escaped hell. Ewes were screaming in the barns as they burned alive. At the door they appeared, father battling his way out of the flames with mother in his arms. His face was set, his eyes blank. All he could think about was making sure she was safe. After he'd taken mother out of the reach of the flames and laid her carefully down in the yard near where I stood, he straightened and, like me, gaped helplessly at the burning building. We hurried over to the barn where the screams of the ewes had died down. Our livestock, father's livelihood, gone. And then, his face hot and glowing in the light of the flames, my father did something I'd never seen. He began to cry. "Father!" I reached for him, and he pulled his shoulder away with an angry shrug. And when he turned to me, his face blackened with smoke and streaked by tears, he shook with restrained violence, as though it was taking every ounce of his self-control to stop himself from lashing out. And lashing out at me. "Poison! That's what you are," he said through clenched teeth. "Poison! The ruin of our lives." "Father!" "Get out of here," he spat. "Get out of here! I never want to see you again." Mother stirred as though she was about to protest, and rather than face more upset, rather than be the cause of more upset, I mounted my horse and left. It would be the last time I saw either of them. 14. I flew through the night with heartbreak and fury my companions, riding the highway into town and stopping at the old shillelagh where all this had begun. I staggered inside, one arm still clutching my hurt chest, face throbbing from the beating. Conversation in the tavern died down. I had their attention. "I'm looking for Tom Cobley and his weasel son," I managed, breathing hard, glaring at them from beneath my brow. "Have they been in here?" Backs were turned to me, shoulders hunched. "We'll not have any trouble in here," said Jack the landlord from behind the bar. "We've had enough trouble from you to last us a lifetime, thank you very much, Edward Kenway." He pronounced "thank you very much" as though it was all one word. "Thank you very much." "You know the full meaning of trouble if you're sheltering the Cobleys," I warned. And I strode to the bar, where he reached for something I knew to be there, a sword that hung on a nail out of sight. I got there first, and stretched with a movement that set the pain in my stomach off, but grabbed it and snatched it from its scabbard in one swift movement. It all happened too quickly for Jack to react. 1 second he'd been considering reaching for the sword, the next instant that very same sword was being held to his throat. "Thank you very much." The light in the inn was low. A fire bimbled in the grate, dark shadows pranced on the walls, and drinkers regarded me with narrowed, watchful eyes. "Now tell me," I said, angling the sword at Jack's throat, making him wince, "have the Cobleys been in here tonight?" "Weren't you supposed to be leaving on the Emperor tonight?" It wasn't Jack. It was somebody else who spoke. Someone I couldn't see in the gloom. Didn't recognize the voice. "Aye, well, my plans changed, and it's lucky they did, otherwise my mother and father would have burned in their beds." My voice rose. "Is that what you wanted, all of you? Because that's what would have happened. Did you know about this?" You could have heard a pin drop in that tavern. From the darkness they regarded me, the eyes of men I'd drunk and fought with, women I'd taken to bed. They kept their secrets. They would continue to keep them. From outside came the rattle and clank of a cart arriving. Everybody else heard it too. The tension in the tavern seemed to increase. It could be the Cobleys. Here to establish their alibi, perhaps. Still with the sword to his throat, I dragged Jack from behind the bar and to the door of the inn. "Nobody say a word," I warned. "Nobody say a bloody word and Jack's throat stays closed. The only person who needs to be hurt here tonight is whoever took a torch to my father's farm." Voices from outside now. I heard Tom Cobley. I positioned myself behind the door just as it opened, with Jack held as a shield, the point of the sword digging into his neck. The silence was deathly, and instantly noticeable to the three men who were a fraction too slow to realize something was wrong. What I heard as they came in was Cobley's throaty chuckle dying on his lips, and what I saw was a pair of boots I recognized, boots that belonged to Julian. So I stepped out from behind the door and ran him through with a sword. "You should have killed me when you had the chance. I'll have it on my gravestone." Arrested in the doorframe, Julian simply stood and gawped, his eyes wide as he stared, first down at the sword embedded in his chest, then into my eyes. His final sight was of his killer. His final insult to cuff gobbets of blood into my face as he died. Not the last man I ever killed. Not by any means. But the first. "Tom, it's Kenway!" came a shout from within the tavern. But it was hardly necessary, even for someone as stupid as Tom Cobley. Julian's eyes went glassy, and the light went out of them as he slid off my sword and slumped in the doorframe like a bloodied drunk. Behind him stood Tom Cobley and his son Seth, mouths agape like men seeing a ghost. Then all thoughts of a refreshing tankard and a satisfying boast about the night's entertainment were forgotten as they turned tail and ran. Julian's body was in the way, and they gained precious seconds as I clambered over him, emerging into the dark on the highway. Seth had tripped and was just picking himself up from the dirt, while Tom, not waiting, not stopping to help his son, had headed across the highway, heading for the farmhouse opposite. In a moment I was upon Seth, the blood-streaked sword still in my hand, and it crossed my mind to make him the second man I killed. My blood was up. And after all, they say the first is the hardest. And wouldn't I be doing the world a favour, ridding it of Seth Cobley? But no. There was mercy. And as well as mercy, there was doubt. The chance, slim, but still a chance, that Seth hadn't been there. Instead, as I passed, I brought the hilt of the sword down hard on the back of his head, and was rewarded with an outraged, pained scream, and the sound of him sprawling, hopefully unconscious, back to the dirt, as I dashed past him, arms and legs pumping as I crossed the road in pursuit of Tom. I know what you're thinking. I had no proof Tom had been there either. But I just knew. I just knew. Across the roadway he risked a quick glance over his shoulder before placing both hands on the top of the stone wall and heaving himself over. Seeing me, he let out a small, frightened whimper, and I had time to think that though he was sprightly for a man of his years, his speed aided by his fear, no doubt, I was catching up with him, and tossed the sword from one hand to the other in order to vault the wall, land on 2 feet on the other side, and sprint off in pursuit. I was close enough to smell his stink, but he'd reached an outhouse and disappeared from view. I heard the scrape of boot on stone nearby, as though a third person was in the yard, and dimly wondered if it was Seth. Or perhaps the farm owner. Perhaps one of the drinkers from the old shillelagh. Focused on finding Tom Cobley, I gave it no mind. By the wall of the outhouse I crouched, listening hard. Wherever Cobley was, he'd stopped moving. I glanced to my left and right, and saw only farm buildings, black blocks against the grey night, and heard only the occasional